So I am Beatrice Asako Kumasaka. I'm the firstborn of the Sansei generation in the United States. My mother and father, well, my grandparents came to the United States at the in 1903 and 1907, and my father's side of the family arrived here sent by my great-grandfather on the Kumasaka side to establish a Christian Japanese community in Seattle. And my mother's side of the family came to the United States and settled in eastern Idaho, brought by my great-grandfather on the Tanagi side of the family to help establish the sugar beet industry in Idaho. My grandmother came over in 1911, and my grandparents' first farm was at 85th and Lenora, a farm and greenhouse operation, and they worked there, leased there until 1919 when they found this site and leased it until and they had to lease it because of the alien land laws that existed in the United States until 1960s and 70s. So they had to lease it. They couldn't purchase the land until 1928, when my father, at age 16, they bought the property in his name because he was a naturalized citizen. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about how you found out about this project.
The archaeology project, actually I just found out about it last week, surprisingly, when I got the film, the Edmonds film, sent to me by my sister-in-law. And so she sent it to me and I watched it and I thought, wow, this is really, really well done. I was really pleased. And in rapid succession, right after I saw that, I was contacted by 3 people for interviews on the family farm. And that was just this past week.
What was the first thing that, other than wow, what was the first thing that came to mind when you saw the film? After seeing the film, what are some of the emotions that you felt? And what's some of the things that, where did it bring you when you came back for that? Or when you thought about it before even coming out, before even deciding to come out here?
Well, my first impression was, wow, they did a great job. And basically that was it. I was just really pleased that this work was going on and they were doing a really good job. And I had been involved in so many things regarding the farm before that, in relationship to, I participated in the putting together the EIS for the pedestrian bridge crossing I-5, and had been extensively interviewed for that. And previous to that, I had also had audio and video sessions with North Seattle Community College, because they were preparing to celebrate their anniversary of when the college started, which I believe was 1970. But with COVID, that whole ceremony that they were preparing for was didn't happen. Yeah.
Did it bring you back at all, back in time, when you saw that piece, or when you were watching that?
You know, this farm has never been out of my life. I mean, I'm so attached to it that it didn't bring back anything at all. But it was interesting to see what was happening, and to see that the history of the family and the property would continue on. You know, that was really great. But
then coming out here today and actually seeing it firsthand, what was that like for you?
Well, it was a little strange because so much has changed, you know, from the old days. There's been so much more growth in the area that it took me a while to recognize where things were. And like this mound that didn't exist, you know, this is where the dirt was left from the construction of the college. So this mound was not in existence until the college construction. But I have such good memories of it that it's always pleasant for me to be here. And a few years ago, I had a family gathering here of all the existing generations of my family, and my brothers and sisters' families all gathered here through my great-grandchildren. I mean, everyone showed up, and I put together a package, and I did a talk about the farm and the family and our family history, and then I led a tour of all of our offspring around the property to show them where different things were. So, you know, it has always been actively in my mind. It's not something that I rediscovered. Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine. When you were sitting over there, when I first got here, what were you telling those students? What were you doing over there?
Oh my gosh. Talking a lot, not just about the farm, but the community that existed here, and the way it affected us personally, being maybe 10% of the Japanese community existed north of the ship canal and got to be known as the Green Lakers. And as you see, one of my father's younger brothers and my mother's younger brothers got together and put together a book that was published and is available at Densho, the Japanese information center, about the Green Lakers, the Japanese-American community that existed north of the ship canal before World War II. And it is really a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful work. So family history has always, has always been a very, very important part of my family. On my mother's side of the family, we have records going back to 600 family lineage, and on my father's side of the family, they have records going back to 900. So this is all just part of the continuing passing on of the family history.
I love
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the family. Tell me your name. Will you introduce it? Can you actually just look into the camera and make sure you're still in frame?
Okay.
And
So,
introduce yourself to Seattle. Talk about some of your memories when you were here, and what does it mean to be a Green Laker?
oh, uh, this farm and my family and the community center that they donated on the property became the center of the Japanese community in the North End. And it was a vibrant community. They had farms and they had shops and they had all sorts of different businesses in the area. When I went to school, well, particularly Roosevelt High School, my mother and father both graduated from Roosevelt High School, and my sister and I also graduated from Roosevelt High School. I graduated in 1956 from Roosevelt, and that was, at that time, there was the largest population in the school. I think it was like a 3-year program, and they had like 3,000 students. The high schools were so overrun with students that the following year, the Seattle metro area built 6 or 8 new high schools to accommodate the overflow. But when I graduated from Roosevelt, out of a student body of 3,000 students, there were probably no more than maybe a dozen minority students in the entire school. One was Chinese, and all the rest of them were Japanese. Yeah. So.
What was that like?
Well, you know, I'll tell you a story about my sister, who graduated in '58 from Roosevelt and went on to the University of Washington, and she found that she really needed to get in touch with the Japanese community, because we were really, other than family, were really isolated from the main community which existed in Chinatown, Rainier Valley, and Beacon Hill. So she joined a sorority on campus that was primarily Japanese young female students, and made lifelong friends there. The first day of college, their first day of college at the university, they all went to their first class as freshmen, which were like 700-seat auditoriums for the freshman classes. And when they got back after that first day of classes, they went back to the sorority, and my sister was astounded to hear her friends speak about how difficult and embarrassing it was in their first classes, because they said, we walked into the classes and down the aisles in these big lecture halls and felt like everyone was staring at them, because they all graduated from Garfield, Franklin, and Cleveland high schools, which had mixed populations, huge mixed populations of Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, black, and white student body. They were used to looking out and seeing faces, Chinese and Japanese and black faces, were very uncomfortable in this white, all white situation. My sister said that she suddenly realized that she didn't experience any of that, and she realized it was because she was raised in the North End with just a tiny pocket of minorities, and so she was used to being surrounded by white faces, didn't think a thing of it, and that was a significant difference in the Japanese communities that were raised in the North and in the South End.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is really interesting.
Yeah.
When you were here, how old were you? Like, what's your oldest memory? Running around this area. Were you born here? Like,
Yeah.
right here?
I was born. My sister and I were born here, and my youngest brother was born while we were on this property.
How old were you? This was before World War II, right?
Yeah.
How old were you when? Kind of explain what that was like when that time, that period, what the atmosphere was like, up until the farm was evacuated. Was it evacuated? And what do you call that? What's the name of that time?
Well, we always call it going off to concentration camps, but the legal name is relocation camps. And we first went into the assembly grounds at Puyallup, the Puyallup Fairgrounds, which was a holding place until the internment camps the construction was completed. We went to Minidoka in Idaho, and so we were in Puyallup Fairgrounds, which ironically they called Camp Harmony, until for about maybe 3 or 4 months before enough construction of Minidoka was completed, and then we went there. And I was 3 when we went into internment. My sister was 1. And then in my brother was born in Rexburg, Idaho, during the war in 1944. He was born in Rexburg. Now both sides of my family, my mother's side of the family and my father's side of the family, had very different experiences during the internment years. A very unusual experience. My father's father, my grandfather, on the Kumasaka side, was picked up early before internment because he was a titular head of the community, and at that time was the president of a Japanese bank that existed in Chinatown. And so the community leaders were all rounded up early on, and he was taken to Camp Savage for internment and investigation before he ended up being sent to Minidoka to join the family. Now, we were at that time living just outside of the city limits of Seattle, and Seattle citizens living inside the city limits were supposed to be sent to Minidoka. We lived across the county line at that time, and we were supposed to go to Tule Lake, but my aunt, my father's younger sister, was a microbiologist who had attended college at Stanford on a scholarship, And because she was a microbiologist, the I can't remember what you would call it. Anyway, the powers that be wanted, the family was supposed to go to Tule Lake, but because they wanted my aunt to be part of the science and medical staff in Minidoka, they sent her, but they also sent the entire family with her to join her in Minidoka. So we ended up going to Minidoka instead of Tule Lake. Now, and so that part of my family were there in Minidoka for the whole internment period, which ended in what, 46. My mother's side of the family had a very different experience because my great-grandfather had taken the family to Idaho to participate in establishing the sugar beet industry. He came over in 1903 or 1905, I can't remember when, brought villagers and his children to Idaho, and they worked with the Mormon ranchers and farmers there to start the sugar beet industry, and became very close friends of that whole Mormon community. Then when we found out about internment, my parents heard a rumor that you might be able to get sponsored out of the internment camps on work permits that were sponsored by white business people in the United States out of the internment zone. And since they were well established with the Mormon ranchers and farmers in eastern Idaho, they contacted a Mormon rancher by the name of Charles Hamilton, who was an old family friend, and told him about this possibility of being sponsored out. And he agreed that if that came to fruition, that he would immediately, as soon as possible, sponsor the Tenagi side of the family out of the internment camps to work for him on his farms and ranches in eastern Idaho. And so we went into Puyallup, but instead of going to Minidoka when the construction was complete, Charles Hamilton sponsored my mother's side of the family out of Puyallup. My mother and my sister and I spent less than a month in Minidoka before we were allowed to go to Sugar City in Rexburg, Idaho, to work on Charles Hamilton's farms. And my mother's mother and her brothers and sisters were all sponsored out of the camp. My father never did go into camp. He was sponsored right out of Puyallup. So the two sides of the family had very, very different experiences during the war years.
Yeah.
My oldest of my brothers was born in Rexburg in 1944, before internment ended, and my father was working he had two different jobs during the war. He was a cook in a sheep camp for Charles Hamilton, where he came home occasionally on a weekend. We didn't eat lamb for decades after that experience because my father just could not stand the smell of sheep and lamb for ages. And after that experience, he worked for an auto shop in Rexburg that was just a few places before away from our home.
Okay, so your father was sponsored straight out of Puyallup.
Yeah.
Like didn't have to really
No.
by Charles Hamilton too? Same person?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
He
So he was out
sponsored
there
he
right away.
sponsored my mother's side of the family, and then but my mother's three younger brothers did not go to Idaho. I think at that point they all volunteered. The oldest brother, Rick Tanagi, was sent to MIS school and became a Japanese interpreter in the Pacific Theater afterwards. The two younger brothers all served in the infantry in World War in Europe. The middle son was.
You have a big aunt right there, just so you know.
The middle son of a brother of the three was severely wounded, almost lost his left arm in Italy, I think it was. So he spent.
So some of your family fought in World War II for.
Oh yeah. A number of relatives did. The younger males joined whenever they could. Joined and served either as MIS. There were other cousins that served in the Pacific Theater as interpreters, and the rest were served in the 442 in Europe. Yeah.
So after coming back from Idaho, what was the plan of action after the internment? When you found out that you no longer had to stay with Charles Hamilton.
So after the end of the war was declared, then we could all come back, but unfortunately, because of the alien land laws that existed until the 60s and 70s, the first generation could not own property. So probably 90% of the Japanese population after internment had no place to go back to because they didn't own their homes. We were fortunate in that we were part of the 10% of the population that actually owned the property, because this property was purchased legally beginning in 1928 when my
Dad was 16.
yeah. And the first thing that my father did when he came back from Idaho was to make the final payment on the property. Yeah.
At that point, what did it look like when you came back? What did you come home to?
Well, they had been working and developing the farm since 1919, and it was really my grandmother's. She was the actual head of the farm and the greenhouse operations. And when she came back, I remember that she stood on the edge of the property and looked at everything and started crying, because she said, I have to start all over again. We were exceptionally fortunate in that one of my father's classmates graduating out of Roosevelt became an attorney His father was our family attorney before him, and so during the war, my parents made him the executor, taking care of the property while we were in internment. That was a lifesaver. He did lease it out for a while to someone who he discovered one day that the company, the farm truck was missing and funds were missing, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the guy who had leased the property had absconded with the money and with the farm truck, but my father's buddy, who was the executor, given executorship while we were gone, reported it to the police. They found the guy and got the truck back. Didn't get the money back, but they got the truck back. And that wasn't the situation for everyone else. I mean, most people came back to nothing because they didn't own, they couldn't own the property that they were living in. So we were very, very fortunate.
Did the community center burn down while you guys were gone too?
It did. During the war, they had a potbelly stove that got overheated and caught fire and burned and it wasn't, vandalism or anything else. It was just, there were people on the property who were using that facility also, and during the night it burned down because of the overheating of a potbelly stove that was in the place. So fortunately, I'm really pleased that it wasn't an act of, vandalism or anything.
What did you guys grow here?
What?
What did you grow here? What was grown here? Tell me about the farm.
We only had one crop that we grew every year, and that was the whole western side of the property was celery. We grew a huge crop of celery every year and then would go down and harvest it. One of my first jobs in our family, when you turned 7, that was the year that you became a worker. You had assigned chores and, et cetera, et cetera. And so my early memories are of the harvesting of the celery and crating it up and putting the crates on a flatbed truck and then hauling it off to some of the produce warehouses that existed down in Soto, and also to the farmers, to the Pike Place Market. Yeah, both sides of my family delivered produce to the Pike Place Market. My family, my Kumasaka side, beginning very early on after the 1900s when they moved here, and my mother's side of the family in the 30s when they moved from Idaho. Yeah.
How old were you when you came back?
I was in Rexburg. I was in first grade. They didn't have kindergartens in Idaho at that time. So I started school at Adams Elementary in Rexburg, Idaho, first grade, and I started second grade. So we came back toward the end of the year, and I started back to school in February of 1947, I think it was, at Oak Lake Elementary School at 100th and Aurora, which is now a shopping center. The school doesn't exist anymore. Yeah.